It was Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Qatar, three Gulf allies who reportedly picked up the phone and asked him directly for clarity on what exactly he was planning to do. Now, 48 hours later, the president is publicly calling Iran's own leadership unbelievably duplicitous, while Tehran flatly denies the very negotiations Trump says are already underway. Two governments telling two completely different stories about the same conversation at the exact moment global oil prices are swinging on every word either of them says. Here's the sequence of events that got us to this exact confusing moment. Over the weekend, according to Axios, Trump had a plan of action ready to go, a major strike against Iran that one American official described as a source of real concern for Saudi Arabia, concern serious enough that Saudi officials reportedly asked the White House for clarity on what was actually planned. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is reported to have personally urged Trump to de-escalate and hold off on launching the strikes. Trump himself later confirmed, speaking to reporters on Air Force One, that he called off the planned attack specifically after being asked to by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and notably Iran as well. That's four governments, three of them close American allies, all pushing in the same direction at the same critical moment. And it worked. The strike didn't happen. In its place, Trump announced that new talks with Iran would begin Monday afternoon, framing it as a real, scheduled diplomatic engagement. And this is exactly where the story splits into two entirely different narratives. Because when Monday afternoon actually arrived, Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson, Esmail Baghai, stood in front of reporters in Tehran and said, in no uncertain terms, that no such talks exist. We are not currently holding negotiations with the United States, he said. Our talks are with Oman, and are focused on reaching an understanding on a route that would allow shipping traffic to safely pass through the Strait of Hormuz. He went further, stating plainly that Iran is not planning to send or host any delegations these days, a direct contradiction of the meeting Trump had just told the world was happening that very afternoon. Trump's response came fast, and it came publicly. He called Iran's leadership unbelievably duplicitous in a social media post and told reporters this represents Iran's last chance to sign a deal. So, who's actually telling the truth here? The honest answer is that both sides may be, depending entirely on how you define talks. Because while Iran is adamant there's no direct US-Iran dialogue happening, Tehran has been unusually candid about a different, very real negotiation that is happening, and happening intensively, with Oman. According to Baghai, negotiations with Oman have intensified significantly over the past week, and have already produced real progress toward a new maritime traffic arrangement for the Strait of Hormuz. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, went even further, telling reporters that discussions between Tehran and Oman over management of the strait are now in their final stages. That single line moved markets almost instantly. Brent crude fell roughly 4.5% on Monday, dropping to just over $83 a barrel, the moment traders heard a senior Iranian official use the phrase final stages. What exactly is being negotiated with Oman, and why does it matter so much that oil prices swing on every update? The core of the dispute goes back to how shipping traffic through Hormuz has actually functioned throughout this war. Under the current arrangement, there's effectively been a northern route controlled by Iran, and a southern route backed by the United States and running along the Omani coast. The US and Iran have repeatedly clashed over this exact divide, with Iran trying to force more shipping onto its own northern route while opposing the American-backed southern passage, a passage it has periodically attacked outright. Baghai described the goal of the current Oman talks as creating a new, temporary route that would replace that dangerous, contested arrangement. One he said would respect the sovereign rights of both Iran and Oman, while explicitly stating it would, in his words, in no way return to the way things were before this war began. In other words, even in the most optimistic version of this deal, Iran is not agreeing to simply hand back pre-war access. It's negotiating a new status quo on its own terms. There's actual, tangible evidence this diplomatic track is producing something real, even amid all the public denials and finger-pointing. The White House has been touting genuine movement, saying roughly 20 vessels have now been allowed to pass through the strait, including 2 Chinese-owned tankers independently confirmed by the ship tracking service Marine Traffic. The administration has pushed back on any suggestion that Iran is being selective about which ships it lets through, though it's worth noting that pushback exists specifically because the perception of selective access, letting some tankers through while blocking others, would itself be a form of leverage Iran could quietly wield without ever officially admitting to it. But here's the detail that should temper any optimism building around this apparent progress. Iran's own parliament has simultaneously advanced a proposal to impose tolls on vessels transiting the strait, alongside broader efforts to assert greater formal control over the waterway itself. The United States has explicitly pushed back on the toll idea, and is actively urging allies to take additional steps to help keep the passage open on terms Washington finds acceptable. So even as ships start moving again, even as negotiators describe reaching the final stages of an agreement, Iran is simultaneously building the legal and political framework to treat Hormuz as something it charges rent on going forward, a fundamentally different outcome than simply reopening a shared international waterway. And the security situation on the water itself remains genuinely volatile, a reminder that diplomatic progress on paper hasn't yet translated into actual safety for vessels in transit. On Friday, an unnamed tanker that had lost command of its own systems was struck roughly 12 miles northeast of Oman's coast. The following day, the master of a separate tanker in the strait reported witnessing a splash and explosion nearby. These aren't hypothetical risks being negotiated away in a conference room in Muscat. They're active, ongoing incidents happening in real time, even as officials describe talks entering their final stages. Making matters worse, Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen have declared their own blockade in the Red Sea, forcing at least 6 Saudi-operated tankers to divert entirely around the African continent, adding 2 full weeks to their journey rather than risk the alternate route. So even if Hormuz genuinely stabilizes, shippers are now contending with an entirely separate choke point hundreds of miles away, one that's just as capable of disrupting global oil flows. There's also been a direct, serious military incident this week that complicates the picture even further. An Iranian strike wounded at least 10 American troops and damaged aircraft at a Saudi airbase, according to an official confirming the incident. That's not the kind of event that happens in a conflict genuinely winding down. That's an active combat casualty event involving American service members on Saudi soil, or in the same narrow window of days where Trump is publicly discussing paused strikes and near final stage negotiations. The contradiction there is stark, and it's exactly the kind of contradiction that's defined this entire war for months. Real diplomatic movement in one channel, real military violence in another, both happening simultaneously, both completely real, neither canceling the other out. So how do you make sense of a story where the American president says talks are happening? The Iranian government says they categorically are not, and yet oil markets are reacting as though something genuinely significant just moved forward. The most honest read, based on everything actually confirmed this week, is that Iran is drawing an extremely precise, deliberate distinction that Trump's public statements are blurring past. Tehran is not, according to its own officials, in the room with American negotiators discussing any broader resolution to this war, its nuclear program, or a longer-term peace framework. What it is doing, intensively, and by its own admission nearing completion, is negotiating a narrow, specific technical arrangement with Oman over how ships move through one stretch of water. Trump appears to be characterizing that Oman-mediated process, one the original ceasefire memorandum in June actually authorized Iran and Oman to work out bilaterally as evidence of broader U.S.-Iran engagement. A framing Bagay has now rejected on the record, twice, in 2 separate press conferences within days of each other. A comment that suggests the White House sees the current maritime negotiation as merely the first domino in a longer sequence, not the endpoint. Whether Iran shares that same sequencing, whether Tehran views a Hormuz arrangement as a stepping stone toward broader talks or as a firm, standalone resolution it has no intention of building on, is precisely the ambiguity nobody outside these closed-door conversations can currently resolve. What we're left with, as of right now, is a war caught in an unusually specific kind of limbo, a massive strike called off at the 11th hour under pressure from America's own regional allies. A public war of words between Washington and Tehran over whether talks even exist. A genuinely real, independently verified maritime negotiation with Oman that both sides agree is happening and both sides describe as nearing completion. Ships actually moving through the strait again in measurable numbers for the first time in weeks. And, running underneath all of that apparent progress, active strikes still wounding American troops, tankers still getting hit, and an entirely separate blockade now forcing ships around the whole of Africa just to avoid a second choke point that's opened up in the Red Sea. Oil prices are telling you, in real time, which version of this story the market currently believes. The cautiously optimistic one, at least for now, with Brent crude pulling back from recent highs on nothing more than a single Iranian official using the phrase final stages. But prices like that can reverse in a single session. Exactly the way they've reversed and spiked and reversed again throughout this entire war, every single time talk of progress runs into the next unconfirmed strike, the next denied negotiation, the next tanker hit in waters everyone insists are supposedly close to being resolved. Watch Oman closely over the coming days. Watch whether that maritime deal that's supposedly in its final stages actually gets signed, or whether it becomes one more agreement that quietly stalls the moment the next incident forces both sides back onto the defensive. Because right now, The difference between a genuine turning point in this war and just another temporary lull in the noise may come down to whether Iran and Oman can finish what they're negotiating before the next explosion in the strait makes the whole conversation moot again.